My grandfather served in the Vietnam War. I was always fascinated about his time in the service, but my mother had instructed me to not ask him about it from a young age. I never did, but he would bring up little bits and pieces now and then. It wasn't often, though. My grandfather was a kind yet strict man. My grandma told me that he was a very laid-back and calm man before the war. But afterwards, he became the old, hardened man that I knew growing up. I distinctively remember playing with military toys as a kid, and he just walked in and shook his head, saying, "It wasn't like that, kid." What I'm trying to say is that, although I love my grandfather, he can be a cold man sometimes. I don't blame him. I didn't see the horrors that he saw. Time has taken a toll on my grandfather, though, and all those years of smoking have finally caught up with him. For the last few weeks, he's been in a hospital on his deathbed. The cancer has spread from his lungs to the rest of his body. I've been spending a lot of time beside his bed, just keeping him company or watching TV with him. Recently, likely because he knows that his time is coming sooner than later, he has been telling stories. Some have been about his childhood, raising my mother, old school friends, while others, and more importantly, have been about his time in Vietnam. The story started off small, with him first telling me about some of his friends that he had served with. As time went on, though, he opened up more and more. He started telling me about the things that he did and saw. He told me about the napalm attacks in the jungle, how he and his squad were right on the outside of the clear zone when it hit. They had watched the planes drop it, setting ablaze the jungle and, in turn, everyone inside. He said that he heard the screams of those burning alive, gut-wrenching, horrible screams of pure agony. "It sounded like hell in our world," he said before stating, "I suppose it was." As if these sounds weren't enough, one of the victims came running out of the inferno, like a ball of fire with arms and legs, my grandfather told me. He said after a few dozen yards, he just fell on the ground screaming. My grandfather and a war friend of his walked over to the burning body to see it struggling to extinguish the flames on the ground. My grandfather looked away from my eyes at this part of the story. "It was just a kid," he sighed. "A kid with flesh melting off his bones." He took a deep breath. "We couldn't just leave him there like that. So I took up my weapon, and I put him out of his misery." I knew that these stories were causing him distress, bringing back memories that he likely had tried to forget for years. I told him that he didn't have to talk about any of this if he didn't want to, but he insisted, saying, "That wasn't even the worst thing that I saw." It was the middle of the day. My grandfather and his squad were walking through the jungle. He said they were doing their usual thing, when his sergeant put his hand up for all of them to stop and stay quiet. "This would happen sometimes," he said. "Sergeant would think that he heard something, and we would have to shut up. Saved our lives a few times, I suppose. Other times," he trailed off. They all sat and listened for a minute, when my grandfather noticed something. Nothing in the jungle was making a sound. No wildlife, no bugs, not even the swaying of leaves in the wind. Nothing. He tightened his grip on his gun as he looked around, his eyes darting from treetop to the ground, searching for the enemy. It was then that he noticed something. "The jungle was always hot. You were never not sweating your butt off, even if you were just standing there," he said. "But then, for that one time, it was cold. Ice cold. In just a second, I could see my breath fog up as it left my mouth." My grandpa turned to see his squad mates all looking around in amazement as well, as they all watched the wisps of their breath fog up in the air. They sat there, frozen in shock at what they were witnessing, when a fellow squad mate right behind him jerked to look around all of a sudden, clearly startled by something he had heard in the jungle. "Tharp, the soldier, we were buddies. We had seen a lot of crap together in the war, so I knew he was usually level-headed, even under fire," my grandpa clarified. "But we could see from the look on his face that whatever he had heard, it had spooked him real bad. And then, out of nowhere, he called out into the jungle, 'Jill!'" Grandpa said he had instantly clapped his hands over Tharp's mouth to shut him up. The soldier struggled against my grandpa to try and break free as the rest of his squad got ready for the inevitable firefight that was sure to come after Tharp had given up their location by yelling. "Wait," I interrupted my grandpa's tale. "Was Jill another soldier?" "Jill was Tharp's girlfriend back home," Grandpa said coldly. "Even with my hand over his mouth, he kept trying to call for Jill, over and over again. I kept whispering to him, 'Tharp, you gotta calm down. Jill's not here. You're gonna get us all killed.' But he just kept struggling." That was when another one called out, this time calling for his mom. No one was there to stop the other soldier like my grandpa had Tharp, allowing the soldier to run straight into the jungle, calling out to his mother. Tharp was fighting to break free, tears now rolling down his eyes as he struggled to break free. My grandpa held his ground though, doing his best to keep the soldier pinned. However, my grandpa was distracted as another soldier ran into the jungle, calling after someone they knew from home. Someone who had no right to be in the jungles of Vietnam. Tharp used the distraction to get out his knife and stab my grandfather in the leg. I screamed as Tharp broke free and ran out into the jungle, calling out for Jill. One by one, the squad broke down, and ran into the jungle. All the while, the temperature seemed to be getting colder and colder. The whole time, soldiers were running into the jungle for someone that they had heard calling for them. My grandfather heard nothing, nor did seemingly any of the other men, until they too ran out of the clearing after a loved one. Eventually, there was only my grandpa and one other soldier, back to back, guns drawn, and at the ready as their breath fogged up into the now cold jungle air. After a moment of silence, screams of the rogue squad mates filled the jungle air all around them. Some sounded far away, while the others seemed to be coming from right next to them. They sounded even more piercing given the silence that had momentarily fallen upon the area. And then it happened for my grandfather. Your grandma. I heard her voice. It was like she was right next to me, whispering into my left ear. His lip was quivering. I turned to look at her when I saw this thing through the trees. It wasn't close to me like it sounded. No, it was a good 30 feet or so back into the clearing. My grandfather paused, so I asked him, "What was it?" He let out a laugh. "Hell if I know. It sure wasn't Charlie, that's for sure. It looked..." He pondered with how he wanted to describe it before saying, "It looked like how radio static sounds. Like I couldn't make out what I was seeing because my eyes were getting a bad signal. I could tell that it was big though. Real big. It looked like a shadow too," he added. "I could see that it was ripping one of our guys apart, sending the camel legs of one of my squad mates hurtling into the jungle. I didn't want to see what it did to the top half of the guy. I don't know if the other guys that ran towards that thing had seen it, or had just heard a voice and ran that direction in a panic. But whatever the reason, I didn't go after it. I was mortified. I grabbed the guy behind me and started dragging him back in the general direction of our base. He figured out what I was doing, and he screamed at me, said that he wasn't going to leave his soldiers behind." Grandpa paused and reached over to his nightstand to grab a glass of water with a trembling hand. He took a long drink before continuing. "I told him it was a suicide mission, that he hadn't seen the thing in the trees, and what it would do to him, but he didn't care. He said we left no man behind, and ran into the trees toward the screams of our friends. I continued my way back to base. It wasn't long until I heard gunshots, then screaming, then nothing." I sat in silence as my mind digested my grandfather's story. "So, what happened next?" I asked. "I made it back to base. I tried telling my superiors what had happened, but they figured I was just some scared kid who had seen his squad massacred in front of him. They weren't wrong about that, but I know it wasn't men or bullets that killed them. I know what I saw." My grandfather passed away about 2 weeks after he had told me that story. Truth be told, I don't know what to think about his story. I figured that I would share it here, let you make your assumptions. But my grandpa was never delusional, even near the end. And although it sounds impossible, I saw the terror in his eyes as he talked about that thing. There was no way anyone would have been able to be that afraid of something that didn't happen.